Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people are talking about the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre. Some are mischaracterizing this as a riot or a racial conflict. This was a mob of white thugs who decided to use the pretext of a teenager falsely accused by a white woman in order to destroy a black community that they wanted their hands on, the land of the district known as Greenwood. To talk about this and a whole lot more, I have with me a remarkable guest, Annalisa Bruner, writer, editor, and great granddaughter of a Tulsa race massacre survivor. She is the author of the work, the Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. I'm looking to have this conversation. Sister, thank you for being on the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Richey. I appreciate your interest and your time.
Absolutely. There are people somewhat confused about the genesis of all of this and why did this happen and why people have not been prosecuted. What I would like you to do, in as brief a time as possible, because we only have a few minutes for the show, I want you to give the real history of what happened and how what happened impacted generations of black families such as yourself beyond that.
What I can say, and that was a wonderful introduction because you set up the framework. This was a race massacre from the very beginning with the intent to, as one of the postcards said, drive the Negro out of Tulsa.
Mhm.
So this was a community of people who had set up a space and a place for themselves to be self sufficient, to rely on one another, because in the era of segregation in which they were living, they actually were not permitted to live elsewhere. They were not permitted to be part of the economic boom from the oil industry that was in place here and that drove Tulsa's very uh, rich economy. They were permitted to work in service jobs in white homes, for etc. They took home good wages for what the work that they did, but at the same time, they were really only permitted to be amongst themselves. But they thrived in that environment. They didn't lament their lot. They did well, probably better than people had expected. But that community was, as you said, sitting on some very valuable property. They were hoping to extend the commercial district, and under the pretext of Dick Rowland attacking Sarah Page, two teenagers, they threatened him with lynching. The Black community resisted and the race massacre was on.
These were independent individuals because when there was word that somehow they were going to try and lynch this falsely accused teenager, men of that community stood up. They went to that sheriff's office. They came armed as they are legally and constitutionally able to do, and they were turned away. But the white mob, however, they were deputized. To this day, there has not been a prosecution of anyone murdered in that massacre, even though it has been deemed to be a murderous massacre by grand juries and beyond. Nobody prosecuted, nobody held accountable. But the white mob, many of them were deputized by the local government to destroy Greenwood. Unpack some of that.
They were absolutely deputized. Not only that, some units apparently of the National Guard were deployed to surround the district. And what ultimately happened was that the people were surrounded as they tried to flee and were mowed down in their tracks. So this was a concerted and pre-planned event, and at the same time, the internment areas where people were taken after they got burned out of their homes had already been constructed. These were not spontaneous events. This was a pre-planned action, and you can tell from the fact of the preparedness of the holding areas, the convention center. These things had been planned a priori.
when you look at what happened over the span of 18 hours, this was a war. And here's what we know about war. And I know people will push back on me and say, no, Dr. Richard, this was not a war. This was, a bad thing and a racial attack, but not a war. Let me tell you why it's a war. A war is defined as this simply: when you kill people and blow things up and you plan to do it. That's what war is. I don't care what you call it on paper. You're going to war. And for them to execute this kind of carnage in such a short amount of time, to basically uproot 10,000 individuals, that took preparation, as you just spoke about. Why do you think there are still narratives that exist that suggest somehow this was simply a cause and effect dynamic and not intended to steal property, kill Black people, and planned well in advance of that racial massacre?
Well, no one wants to say that they are that uncivilized, that
Mm.
savage, that animalistic in their behavior toward other humans. So, just as we know certain justifications for the enslavement of other humans somehow rests on a mythology, there is a persistent mythology that certain people are comforted by, and they do not want to look into the deep abyss of their own souls and see that and admit and confess that these kinds of behaviors, the savagery, the barbarity, the behavior outside of the social confines of civilization, that they have engaged in them without provocation. That is the height of uncivilization. And certain people do not want to admit that that's the case.
For many years, there was an intentional cover up of what happened. And we had to rely on oral rendition. We had to rely on records that were not well kept. And now there's this new energy behind understanding exactly what happened. You're the great granddaughter of a Tulsa race massacre survivor. I'm sure there were stories passed down through your family, things that you knew about that others were not on top of yet. Tell us some of those oral traditions that you were made aware of, the nuances of this massacre that may not have made it to the public.
Well, a couple of things I'd like to say. It wasn't that these histories were lost, they were intentionally suppressed.
Mhm.
As I said, the city fathers were some embarrassed by the extent to which the destruction happened. And it was a bad public relations look for the city, which had kind of projected itself across the country and the world as a place to come and do business and to live well and to enjoy life. But when you have a stain like this on the community, uh, it doesn't. It just doesn't look good. The Chamber of
Mhm.
Commerce and others suppressed the story, removed journalistic records, and so forth. And over a period of decades, there was an imposed silence within the community. Now, as far as my personal situation is concerned, I am actually the descendant of two survivors,
Mm.
my great grandmother and my grandmother, her small child at the time, who was 7 years of age and would have been the same age at that time in 1921 as Mother Viola Fletcher, who testified before Congress and put her words into the congressional record a couple of weeks ago. It's very important to distinguish between an oral record in terms of oral history, the congressional record, and the written record that my great grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish, wrote in real time immediately in the aftermath of the massacre. All of her stories about herself and the notes that she took from other survivors corroborate and align exactly with what oral histories have said. And so the facts are incontrovertible. It
Mm.
is what happened. Planes did fly overhead, throwing out dynamite sticks or turpentine bombs, burning the buildings from the top down. as marauders came through with torch in hand, doused the buildings with kerosene and set them aflame, driving people from their homes and shooting them as they exited, fleeing for their lives. So this is a horrible and graphically violent event. Not something that anyone wants to dig up or certainly make up. And so we know that these things are true, despite efforts over the generations to silence people. My knowledge of the events came through the book that was passed down through my family.
This has been a remarkable conversation. I appreciate you. Thank you for telling your story, and thank you for continuing to educate the masses on what really happened at the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.